Welcome back to Forsyth Virtual Academy's United States History course. In this part of our unit, we are going to take a look at the impact of slavery and the division it created between the North and the South. Even after ratification of the Constitution, debate continued on how much power the federal government should have over the state. This became critical when citizens of individual states disagreed with federal laws and regulations. This issue is known as states' rights. In 1828, a protective tariff was passed that made goods manufactured in Europe but sold in the United States more expensive. A tariff is basically a tax placed on goods that are imported, meaning they come into your country from somewhere else. The idea behind the tariff was that if manufactured goods being imported from Europe were more expensive, then people would choose to buy goods that were made within the borders of the United States. In the North, the tariff received strong support because this is where most U.S. manufacturing took place. So it makes a lot of sense that they'd support the tariff, right? Because that means they're going to sell more of their products because the other products from Europe are going to be more expensive. This support was not the case in southern states where cotton was often traded for manufactured goods. Many southern states viewed the new tariff as a threat to their economies. As the southern states voiced their concerns over the tariff, Vice President John C. Calhoun argued that states had the right to nullify or cancel any federal legislation that was not in their best interest. In completely unrelated news, John C. Calhoun looks a lot like the bad guy, Norman Osborn, from the first Spider-Man movie. I'm pretty sure he was the Green Goblin. I should get some street cred for knowing that. Okay, back to the important stuff here. So the South wasn't pleased with this whole idea of protective tariffs, so they threatened to secede from the Union. Up first, the state of South Carolina was the first to take action and pass the Ordinance of Nullification in 1832. Basically, the ordinance claimed that some laws that the federal government created were good, and some laws that the federal government created were bad. And the ones that South Carolina did not agree with would not be enforced and were found to be illegal within the borders of South Carolina. This soon became a national issue, known as the Nullification Crisis. However, it quickly came to an end after the tax was lowered and South Carolina agreed to the new federal tariff. As you can imagine, this would sort of be a problem if states could just decide, yeah, I'm going to follow some laws, and yeah, I'm not going to really care about the others. While tariffs are something that states could come to an agreement on, there is one states' right issue that continued to divide them, and that's the institution of slavery. In 1793, the Fugitive Slave Law was passed. This required the return of slaves who had run away to northern states, looking for their freedom. In 1850, the law was strengthened when the non-return of runaway slaves became a crime, punishable by a $1,000 fine. This meant that regardless of how you felt about slavery, if you knew of an escaped slave, you were required to capture and return them. In the South, plantation owners lived in fear of slave revolts, and those fears were realized in 1831 when Nat Turner led 6 other slaves to kill the plantation family that owned him. This rebellion, known as Turner's Rebellion, eventually grew to include over 60 slaves who killed at least 55 white citizens. The slaves were eventually caught and hung, including Nat Turner. Turner's Rebellion further strengthened the fears of Southern plantation owners and led to tighter control over enslaved African Americans. Meanwhile, a growing segment of the population was actively rallying against slavery. Abolitionists like the Grimke sisters, William Lloyd Garrison, and Frederick Douglass wrote and spoke out against slavery. Douglass, who had been born into slavery, learned how to read and write, escaped to New York and became a very influential writer and speaker in the anti-slavery movement. By the 1850s, the economic differences between the northern and southern states were significant. In the north, you found small farms and a growing manufacturing industry, as well as political and social reform movements, including the abolition of slavery. While in the south, you found large farms dependent on cotton and rice production. Few factories were there with very little manufacturing, and plantation owners believed their financial future depended on the use of slave labor. The differences between the North and the South became very apparent as new states tried to join the Union. In 1818, Missouri applied for statehood, and the question became, would they enter as a free or a slave state? The Missouri Compromise of 1820 settled the matter by banning slavery in all land within the Louisiana Purchase, lying above the 3630 North Parallel. The exception to this rule was Missouri, which would enter the Union as a slave state. However, there was still the issue of representation in Congress. Remember that states send representatives to the House and Senate in order to represent their interests in the federal government. At the time of Missouri's application for statehood, the balance of power in Congress was equal between free and slave states. But if Missouri entered as a slave state, that would upset that balance and give slave states more opportunities to influence congressional decisions. To counteract this effect, Maine was entered at the same time with free state status. The issue of slavery in new states comes to the forefront again in 1850, when California applies to become a free state. Again, the issue of representation becomes unbalanced, and southern states began to worry. In response to these southern fears, Congress passed the Compromise of 1850. This compromise allowed a state to determine its slave status, making the Missouri Compromise invalid. Unfortunately, these things like the Compromise of 1850 was simply putting a band-aid on a much larger problem and setting us up for the inevitable Civil War.